Thank you. So welcome, class of 2021, and welcome friends and colleagues and Gettysburgians alike. I first want to thank both President Riggs and Provost Abbey for asking me to speak tonight, and also to thank my colleagues, Professor Melton and Professor Hancock, for comments on earlier drafts of this speech. So I have to tell you guys, the speech was really difficult for me to write. While I was working on it, 2 weeks ago, a white supremacist committed an act of domestic terrorism during a gathering which was one of the worst, most public showcases of white nationalism, bigotry, and racial hatred that we've seen in America today. As you all know, the event ended in tragedy when Heather Heyer, an American protester, was murdered and 19 others were injured. Many white Americans were surprised that things had gotten this far. Most black Americans, myself included, expected worse. Once again, the chasm between black and white America that many people thought had disappeared over the past several decades had revealed itself. When I sat down to write my comments for this evening, I was plagued by a sense of personal weariness and frustration. I struggled with writing a speech about hope and the promise of the Gettysburg Address when it's been so difficult for us all to find that optimism today. As the nation did in 1863, we again find ourselves in an era of deep social, political, and racial conflict. This startling difference in understanding race relations has haunted us since emancipation. When Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, the nation was exhausted by the ravages of the Civil War. Over 10,000 soldiers had been killed 4 months earlier in the Battle of Gettysburg, and the president had the grim responsibility of dedicating the National Cemetery for the Union dead. By the time of the address, the conflict had been raging for more than 2 years. The audience was weary, and as battle-fatigued as whites were, blacks, who had already endured the horrors of hundreds of years of enslavement, were even more so. At that point, Americans were questioning whether the conflict was worth it. In his address, in the simplest of terms, Lincoln told the country that yes, America was worth fighting for. He said, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for all the people, shall not perish from the earth." But only 40 years later, in the souls of black folk, W.E.B. Du Bois lamented the disappointment of emancipation for American blacks, who once released from bondage, believed that they would enjoy the full citizenship that they had fought for in the Civil War. He says about African Americans after the war, quote, "The first decade was merely a prolongation of the vain search for freedom, the boon that seemed ever barely to elude their grasp, the holocaust of war, the terrors of the Ku Klux Klan, the lies of carpetbaggers, The disorganization of industry and the contradictory advice of friends and foes left the bewildered serf with no new watchword beyond the old cry for freedom. As the time flew, however, he began to grasp a new idea, the ballot. Had not votes made war and emancipated millions? Had not votes enfranchised the freedmen? Was anything impossible to a power that had done all this? 1 million black men started with renewed zeal to vote themselves into the kingdom. So the decade flew away. The revolution of 1876 came and left the half-free serf weary, wondering, but still inspired. Slowly but steadily, in the following years, a new vision began gradually to replace the dream of political power. A powerful movement, the rise of another ideal to guide the unguided, another pillar of fire by night after a clouded day. It was the idea of book learning, the curiosity of longing to know. Here at last seemed to have been discovered the mountain path to Canaan, longer than the highway of emancipation and law, steep and rugged but straight, leading to heights high enough to overlook life. Up the new path the advance guard toiled, slowly, heavily. It was weary work. To the tired climbers, the horizon was ever dark. The mists were often cold. The Canaan was always dim and far away. African Americans knew what Canaan meant. It was the realization of true citizenship, the promised land. How dim and far away is Canaan for us today? The problem that Du Bois points out, and the problem that we still face today, is that we usually only talk about the Battle of Gettysburg as a turning point in the Civil War, which ultimately led to Union victory. We always frame Lincoln's address in such optimistic terms that we don't spend enough time reflecting on everything that came both before and after. In closing, I want you all to think about the importance of where we are and why the Gettysburg Address is relevant today as it was in 1863. Like the country then, you are now at a turning point yourselves. One of my students who will be graduating this year told me that she wished the speaker of her first-year walk had told her class that it isn't important where you begin your journey, but where you finish it. She also hoped that I would tell you that the beginning of college is a good time to start fresh and become the person you want to be. What better advice for all of us who have been complacent so far in the defense of our national values? We've been reeling with shock and disappointment for months, but we don't get to be surprised anymore. That time has long passed. Gettysburg College is a different place than it was a year ago. In some ways that's good, in some ways it's not. We've grown, and for some of us that evolution has been really painful. We have looked directly into the eyes of some ugly truths about our friends, our colleagues, and ourselves. Some of us have been shocked to realize that, as Du Bois pointed out over 100 years ago, quote, "The nation has not yet found peace from its sins. The freedman has not yet found freedom in the promised land. Whatever of good may have come in these years of change, the shadow of a deep disappointment rests upon the Negro people," end quote. This bone-deep disillusionment plagues us all today in one way or the other. Though deep disappointment always rests with those most marginalized and most exhausted by the fight for equality and justice, it is up to all of us to continue to grapple with the great task before us. This is a burden we must share as a community, even when we don't feel fully capable. In 1922, Du Bois said, quote, "Abraham Lincoln was perhaps the greatest figure of the 19th century. I love him, not because he was perfect, but because he was not and yet triumphed. The world is full of illegitimate children. The world is full of folk whose taste was educated in the gutter. The world is full of people born hating and despising their fellows. To these I love to say, see this man? He was one of you, and yet he became Abraham Lincoln." Thank you.